Hi, I'm Profi, and we're going to be picking up here talking about the principles of macroeconomics, specifically looking at economic growth. And to be very clear what we're talking about here, we're not talking about economic growth that happens, say, over the course of a few months or a year or even a couple years. We're talking about the kind of growth that happens over decades or centuries, so very long periods of time. And nonetheless, we see growth has happened over the past several centuries. So let's get to it. So here we go. We're going to talk first about the fact that economic growth is a fairly recent phenomenon. Then we'll look at the various components of economic growth. Then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about economic growth accounting, so how we can account for economic growth based on those components. Look at a little bit at how policy can have an impact on economic growth over the long term. And then finally, look at the phenomenon that we call economic convergence and some of the debate surrounding, well, whether it happens, and if so, why, or if not, why might it not? So the first thing I want to establish is that economic growth is actually a fairly recent phenomenon, right? So if you go back and you look at, say, what the world was like 2,000 years ago, and compare that to the world about 1,000 years ago, it looks remarkably similar in terms of the level of material well-being, right? With most people basically living a subsistence life, with only a few exceptions of maybe the very high elites living above subsistence. And even in their case, they're generally significantly poorer than what we would be today. I mean, think about just something very simple. Um, I don't have to worry about dying from simple infections because we have medication now and I can afford it, despite the fact that I'm not exceptionally wealthy or anything like that. Where that was simply not true of kings back in 1000 AD. Right, so what's going on? So if you go back before around about 1000 AD or so, so about 1,000 years ago, we lived in what was described as a Malthusian world or the Malthusian trap. This was described by Thomas Robert Malthus, right, who was actually a minister, but also looked some at kind of social science and at population growth in particular. And he describes a feast-famine cycle. Right? So the basic idea is this, that food production grows basically linearly. Right, so it's more or less a constant rate at which that would grow, while population growth is exponential. Right, so population can grow very, very fast when it's growing. So what happens is that if we happen to be in a time where food is abundant, right, so it is more than what is necessary for subsistence, what we find is that population will grow very quickly, right, to consume that available food. This is the feasting period. So since population is growing really fast, it actually outgrows the amount of food that is available. So food is growing relatively slowly, population is growing really fast. We end up outstripping our food supplies. Then what happens is we enter a period of famine, where food is less than is necessary for subsistence for the entire population, and as a result, the population will decline through a number of possible ways. Right? Maybe we start to get desperate, so we start seeing wars being fought over resources, or just plain out starvation, or because of lack of nutrition, we see disease runs rampant. For all of these kinds of reasons, we tend to see population kept in check. Right? So it is this problem of the feast-famine cycle that prevents us, right, from really being able to become wealthy. Once we start becoming wealthy, population catches up with us, and we end up right back where we started. So what broke us out of this Malthusian trap? Right? Well, this started, a number of things happened from about the year 1000 AD to 1800 AD. This started really in Western Europe over a period of about 500 years, starting around that 1000 AD time period, and then spread right from that area throughout much of the world. We see a number of different factors that kind of happen around the same time. So there is some debate about which of these is the most important factor. But the first thing we see the rise of capitalism happens. Now, what that means then is we see more investment in physical capital. So a building up of things like machinery. We see innovation attached with that. We see the rise of economies of scale, right? So factory style production, where mass production allows us to be more efficient with the resources that we have. So this allows our resources to grow more than linearly. We can actually grow in a way that not only keeps up with population, but in fact outstrips population. So this is all stuff that we see happening around the Industrial Revolution. Another thing that happens is that we have the bubonic plague comes and destroys a bunch of the population. Now, this is obviously a bad thing in terms of human cost, but one of the things that it did was that it changed the ratio between the amount of capital we had, right? So the various machines, tools, equipment, and the like, and the amount of labor that we had, so that capital is now relatively more abundant. This in turn tends to make workers more productive. This is a process we call capital deepening that we'll come to again here in a little bit. Right, so this is something that's brought about, in this case, not because of the buildup of capital, but rather because of the destruction of the population. But then that in turn means that those workers that remain are quite productive. Another thing that happens is a change in the philosophy of how governments should operate, specifically with more emphasis being put on the rule of law and the right of contract. So the rule of law is this idea that we should have a set of rules, right, that are clear, that are publicly known, that are considered to be fair, and are well enforced. Right? So this is very different from, say, the rule of kings, where the king can just arbitrarily decide what they wish and change their minds at the drop of a hat or drop of a crown, as the case may be. Right? So the rule of law creates then a system in which what rules are going to be enforced becomes predictable for the people. Once things become predictable, that then creates the ability to plan for the future. Another thing that helps with this is the right of contract. This is something that tends to come along with the rule of law. That is, that people are allowed individually to make enforceable private agreements between each other. That is, we have a court system that will actually uphold contracts that are agreed to. This again creates a certain amount of predictability, allows you to plan for the future, and therefore to set resources aside for the future. As we do that, we see growth happen. A last thing that happens is the rise of what we may call bourgeois culture. This was something that Deirdre McCloskey has talked about recently, and it's not just these technical things that have happened or these legal things that have happened, but there was a change in the way that people thought about commerce and innovation. Rather than seeing commerce as kind of a secondary thing or something that's beneath the upper classes, it began to be something that was respected and seen as potentially virtuous. This happened especially around the time of the Protestant Reformation, as we started to see an erosion of that separation between the sacred and the secular. Another thing related here is process of innovation as being something that people were excited about. Things like the printing press played a huge role in making the Reformation possible, but then also created the possibility for the spread of knowledge to occur. Another thing that came along here is the general idea of a certain equality of persons, regardless what your social status might be. Now, this is also connected with the rule of law. This idea that it doesn't matter whether you're part of the nobility or part of the common folk, you have certain things that you should have protected and you should be allowed to do, right? You can, in fact, enter into agreements with one another. You can expect, right, the provision of law, protection of your rights, be something that is respected. So these types of ideas all come in and kind of intermingle both the technical side with things like the Industrial Revolution, economies of scale, the economics, I guess the political side with the rule of law, right of contract being respected, and then also a culture that is supporting that. So really, what we have happening is this big interaction happening, right? So in my mind, the way we can interpret this is the fundamental issue when it comes to economic growth is asking the question, right, can we produce enough to cover our necessities? And I don't mean like, oh, I need to have that new Nintendo. I mean necessities like really physical necessities in order to survive and reproduce, right, as human beings, as biological creatures, right? Can we produce enough to cover that? Right? If the answer is yes, then the question is, what do we do with the resources we have beyond that, especially things like time, right? So if we're simply in a world where we're working to eat and then we just enjoy leisure after that, we will not expect any material progress to happen. All that's going to happen is if I become very productive, I'm going to become very lazy. I will not work very much. On the other hand, if I work and I produce everything that I need, and then I continue to work to produce more than I need, we will see material progress happen. Now, one thing that's important to remember is this idea of work to eat, right? Living in that kind of world makes sense if storage is really difficult or really unsafe. It might be because of rot, rats, or raids, right? So all kinds of things that could make it so it really doesn't make sense to try to save up. If the reality is that once I start saving up, somebody's going to come in and take it, whether it be a rat or whoever it happens to be, barbarians or what have you, then it really doesn't make sense for me to try to save, right? So in that case, it makes sense. I work to eat and then I just relax after that, and we won't see material progress. But once we start seeing your rights to your property being protected, then okay, raids stop being so much an issue. You don't have to worry about the king coming and just seizing your stuff because you happen to have stockpile. Once that becomes the case, now it starts to make sense to try to build up for the future, and you can start thinking of other ways to use your time, right? So, and if you also have a culture now, right, that sees virtue, right, in work and in trying to make progress, and supports that security of property, both politically and also culturally, now we've created an environment in which it makes sense, right, for you to try and develop yourself. So I really suspect that what was going on, it's not a matter of which of these four things made it happen. It was really the combination that to get that growth, we need to have both the institutional factors that are cultural, that are legal, and also the technical factors of the physical productivity, which were brought about by things like capital deepening from the bubonic plague and the economies of scale from the Industrial Revolution. So now let's look at the components of economic growth. Right? So we know that gross domestic product, kind of the standard way we measure economic activity, is produced by a combination of your workforce or labor, right, capital, which has both a physical form, that is like machines, equipment, factories, infrastructure, all of these types of things, or the physical stuff that we use to produce other stuff, or sometimes called the produced means of production. And we also have human capital, right? So those would be like the skills that you have beyond just your raw capacity for work, things like education, experience, training, all of these. And then we have beyond that, we would call technology. Now, technology is often spoken of, and we think of things like invention and innovation, right? So coming up with, say, new products, whether those new products be new like consumer products, smartphones, and the like, or right, new products that make us more productive, right? So, say, new machines we can put onto an assembly line that help us to make certain uh, and we waste fewer resources or what have you, or have time-saving technologies. Well, then we also have innovation that happens. So these improvements that occur in processes that already exist. So those are part of technology. But then I'd also add to that these institutions, the cultural and political elements as well, play into right, our ability to produce. Right? So it's really the combination of these four things. Right? Labor, the workforce, capital, both in the physical and human form, so physical capital, human capital, and then finally technology. Now, simply growing the economy in terms of GDP doesn't necessarily make us richer. After all, right, we could just have more people. So that this is something we see. Say if you compare, say, a country with a very large population with with a relatively small population, you will often see that the large population, you have a larger GDP. Right? So compare, say, India with Luxembourg. Now, does it then follow that India is richer than Luxembourg? Well, not really. In fact, Luxembourg is per person, I believe, the wealthiest country in the world, or at least near the top. It's a very rich country, where India has a lot of people that its money is being spread around. So it's maybe kind of a middle income country at this point. And so for economic growth to happen on a per capita basis or per person, that is really what it takes for us to say that people have a better life. For that to happen, we need a combination of two things, right? So one being capital deepening. So capital deepening is the idea that we have more physical capital per person or more human capital per person. So I already mentioned how we can have additional physical capital per person if we have something like a plague that doesn't destroy the physical capital, but it does destroy some of the population. That'd be one way that can happen. Or we can build up physical capital. If we in fact have more machines per person, then we have what we call a deeper level of capital. Similarly, human capital can be deepened as well if we increase the amount of education that people have. Right? So if we move from, say, a society in which, say, an elementary school education is kind of what's standard, to one where a high school education is standard, then we have human capital deepening. or if we move from that to where it's more standard to have a 4-year college degree. Like all of these would be a process of capital deepening, which could improve the level of economic growth we see on a per capita basis. And then finally, the question of technology. Now, there is a little bit of debate. I'd say whether we should just include technology itself or technology per person. Uh, the reality is technology is hard to measure anyway, so measuring it per person really gets kind of dodgy. More about that in just a minute. Okay. So, we have these four areas that lead to economic growth. Workforce, but we're going to focus on per capita, so let's set that one aside and instead focus on the other three. So, two capital deepenings, physical and human capital deepening, and technology. Right, so what we do is we track over time what's happening to GDP, what's happening to the size of your workforce or population, what's happening to the amount of physical capital, what's the amount of human capital you have. These are all things that we can actually track the data of. Right? So population is something that is tracked by most countries on a reasonably regular basis through things like the census. Physical capital, the data there is generally a little bit fuzzier, but nonetheless, we can get reasonable data that gives us estimates, if nothing else. Similarly with human capital, we have things like, see if you look at the United States, what proportion of the population has gone to college and graduated, or gone to college and hasn't graduated, have high school diplomas, and so on. Right? So we can track things like that. Right? Now, so then what we do, we look at how much GDP has changed. That's economic growth. We look at the changes in all of these factors we can measure, workforce, physical, and human capital, and then say, well, how much of the GDP change can be explained by those factors? And whatever can't be explained by those, we would call technology change. Right? Now, that is, technology is something we really can't measure it directly. Right? So that's why it's kind of whatever's left is technology. Well, it turns out what's left is really important. So when we do these growth accounting studies, what we find is that over half of the change that we see in GDP over long periods of time can be chalked up to technology. That is, the growth in population, the growth in physical and human capital simply is not enough to explain the growth that we see in gross domestic product. So it must be technology. Now, there are a couple interpretations of this reality, right, that most is technology. One possible interpretation is that technology matters a lot. Right? So what really matters are things like invention, innovation, and institutions. Now, there's another approach which says, well, if you go back to the first point in this slide, technology is just what's left over. So what that really means is that we don't know what causes economic growth. Over half of it is basically unexplained. We just took this unexplained thing and called it technology. Right? So you can't interpret this one either way. So then, how can policy potentially have an impact? Well, let's focus in then on human capital, physical capital, and technology. When we look at human capital, the big way that a policy can have an impact is if we subsidize education and training. So if we devote governmental resources and therefore resources that are coming from society as a whole, so having to pay for these things through taxes or borrowing, which is just future taxes, in that case, we're building up the human capital structure. For fiscal capital, we can do things like providing tax breaks for saving and investment. One common way we see that is, for example, in the United States, we have the capital gains tax is something that is at a reduced rate compared to other income taxes. This is in effect a tax break, right, for the income that comes from saving and investing, right? Or more directly, governments spend money on infrastructure. And infrastructure is part of the physical capital that can potentially make us more productive if it's well invested. And then when we look at technology, we can do things like if we have patent protection. Patent protection can help to encourage a level of innovation. Although I will say this is something, as the slide said, it's a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, right, patent protection can sometimes encourage people to innovate because you're going to have patent protection rights will then make whatever your invention is more profitable for those first few years as it's protected. But then you have the other problem of people protecting their patents preventing others from innovating. Right, so you get into these patent wars, and we can end up with a lot of resources being spent just trying to protect your patent rights from other people. Uh, Resources being spent that way tend not to lead to economic growth. So we do have that issue. Another thing that can happen is subsidizing research. Now, in this case, it needs to be research that will actually benefit us in terms of economic growth, right? It's not research that really doesn't do much for us. But if it is something that pushes technology forward in a meaningful way, then this is something that could potentially increase economic growth. Now let's get into the last topic, that is the topic of economic convergence. Sometimes this is known as catch-up growth. So what this is that there's a tendency, right, when we look at economic growth rates and compare, say, the poorer countries as a group with wealthier countries as a group, you will often see that poorer countries have higher growth rates than wealthier countries. So this tends to lead then to those poorer countries over time catching up with the relatively richer countries who are growing more slowly. Now, I will say, while we have a name for this, we talk about this phenomenon, there is debate as to whether or not it's something that actually happens on a regular basis or whether it's something that's just kind of an accident, right? So let's talk about a couple of the arguments for convergence, why this economic convergence would happen. Well, first, and probably, I'm not going to say necessarily the most important, but certainly one of the most fundamental ideas, is diminishing returns to capital. Right. So the idea here is that a rich country tends to be rich because it has a large amount of physical capital in comparison with a poorer country. That is, what distinguishes the rich countries from the poor countries is factories. We have a lot more manufacturing, that's going to be something that makes us relatively richer. That's the idea, as opposed to, say, somewhere where the main industry is subsistence farming. Okay. Well, what happens though with physical capital is that physical capital is diminishing marginal returns. That is to say, right, when that second machine or each additional chunk of capital, right, or machine, whatever it happens to be, it's going to increase output by less than the previous chunk did. Right. What that means, though, then, is because all this machinery depreciates, that is, it wears and tears at basically the same rate, right, as growth happens, you're investing more machinery, that machinery is going to wear and tear, but the amount that it's adding to output, right, is going to be less than the previous chunk. So what ends up happening is, in terms of how much you're adding to output once you subtract off depreciation, you're adding less and less, right, to output by investing in more capital. Okay, so that's the problem you run into. And eventually you'd get to the point where any savings that you're putting in is really just replacing the capital that you have. You're not going to be growing anymore, at least not from physical capital. And so that's the problem you run into. So growth rates will tend to slow as more capital accumulates, which means then if you're in a country that has relatively less capital, right, you don't have much depreciation happening yet. So when you invest in more capital, that's going to add a lot to your ability to create output compared to the relatively wealthier country where a lot of the investment they're doing is just having to replace the machinery they already have. A second argument, or I guess set of arguments for convergence, is the idea of copycatting. Right. So yes, in the world of physical capital, it's really all about this diminishing returns. But we know that technology, as far as we can tell, is the most important thing. And if we break technology down into kind of two main components, one would be what we actually think of as technology, innovation, invention. It turns out that's fairly easy to copycat. And we even have stories in the Industrial Revolution of Americans sending people over to the United Kingdom, Britain, right, to see how their factories worked, memorize the kind of schemata and all of that, and then bring it all back. Right, so a lot of American growth in those early days was copycat growth, specifically about technology. Another area of copycatting that can happen is in institutions. That is, when we live in an international world where there is reasonable information that is spreads around the world about institutions, what kind of policies and cultures work in terms of creating growth, then there can be a tendency for us to copy those things that do actually work. And in fact, you will often see this kind of argument given for specific policies. We say, oh, well, why are we doing this? Well, all of these other countries do it, and it seems to work for them. Right? So this copycatting is very explicit in something that countries will do. Now, whether it always works, that's another question. But that is at least something that becomes possible, which means then if you're the one with the best institutions, you don't have anybody to copy. Anything you copy is going to make you worse, whereas everybody else copying you is going to make you better, make them better. Similarly with technology, if you're the one with the most advanced technology in your factories, you don't have anybody to copy that's going to improve things. Right? So that is where this would be, again, an argument for convergence. If you're at the top, you don't have anyone to try to be as good as anymore. Whereas everybody else can at least copy what you're doing and thereby catch up toward you. Now, there are, however, some arguments against convergence happening. So one is, again, looking at the importance of technology, right? So there's this one theory out there we call endogenous growth theory. So the idea of endogenous growth theory is that technology doesn't just happen. This is the point they make. Instead, technology is the result of research and development. And research and development is something that rich countries can afford more easily, right? So if you're a wealthy country, you have all of your needs taken care of. You have plenty of resources left to have, say, people work as engineers, inventors, entrepreneurs, and the like. You can make all of these various types of innovations. It's something that you can afford with the resources you have. And as these innovations happen, that is going to fuel even more economic growth. So the rich countries will get richer because they can invest in the things that lead to growth. And so this idea of endogenous growth suggests that growth leads to more growth, right, through this process. You grow, you become richer, you can devote even more resources to growth. So this would suggest then that we don't have to the copycatting actually might be more difficult than it sounds. Another question that comes up connected with this is, are there diminishing returns to technology? Right? So if we're talking about investing in technology, does that hit the same diminishing returns problem that we see with physical capital? It's not immediately obvious whether it does or not. Right? So what's possible? Well, this really gets down to a more fundamental philosophical question, and that is, how is knowledge created? So is knowledge something where like there are all of these facts about reality that are out there, and we have to discover them? Right? So it's this discovery process. Now, if so, one would expect there would be diminishing returns to technology, because there are some facts that are going to be more obvious than others, right? So it's in effect very much like I have backyard apple trees, right? Well, what do? You pick the low-hanging fruit first. Those are the easy ones. But every apple I pull off that tree leaves fewer apples left. And the apples that are left are the ones that are harder to get to. Right? So if we believe this is the way knowledge works, there are a certain number of facts out there about the universe, and we are discovering them one at a time. We discover the most obvious first. After that, it's going to take more resources to get that next discovery, and so on. Then there would be diminishing returns to investments in technology. On the other hand, there's the possibility that the relevant knowledge here, right, that is the kind of knowledge that leads to innovation, is actually constructed rather than discovered. So this would happen, say, if ideas are much more like, I don't know, like recipes or a chemical formula, right? Where the way you get an idea is you take two other ideas, right? So you take idea A and idea B and you smash them together, and that creates a new idea, idea C. Right? So you took when you just had one combination you could do before, A and B. Now you have A, B, and C, which you can try combining. So you can try A and B again, right? So that's one combination. But you can also try A and C, that's a second combination, or B and C, right? So it's a third combination. So all of these different combinations can then result in new ideas, right? So we have A and B combined gave us C, A and C give us D, right? B and C give us E. Right? So now we have five ideas. We went from one, jumped up to three ideas, then five ideas, and then we think about how these five ideas can interact, right? So we already did the interactions between A, B, and C, but now we have D and E get to interact with each of the other three. So we have what, a total of, that's another seven combinations that can happen because they interact with each other as well, right? So we have all kinds of new ideas can grow this way. So if knowledge is constructed in this way in the innovative process, in that case, the growth of knowledge is in fact going to be exponential. I remember it was back when I was in high school, my economics teacher said that what Malthus didn't realize is that he was trapped thinking about population and physical resources. And then you run into that problem. He didn't understand that technology is a multiplier of resources. And if technology doesn't grow linearly, then we end up being able to become extremely prosperous. So if you look over the past several centuries, you can see we live a wildly different life than people lived 1,000 years ago, even though their lives were remarkably similar to 1,000 years before that. So that's just a little bit about economic growth, how we think about it, some of the debates about that. I hope this was interesting. As for now, thank you.